Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Hi, Rowan. Happy Earth Day, or Earth Week, I guess, as we're calling it now.
Yes, that's right. So we've got Julian Morris of the Reason Foundation. Julian's research is focused on the relationship between economic development and environmental protection. It's the 51st anniversary of Earth Day. It was started back in 1970. So we thought it would be appropriate to have a scholar on the environment this week, especially with Biden's green initiatives embedded in the so-called infrastructure proposal. The trillions the Biden administration wants to spend isn't even enough. AOC, along with our Senator Alex Padilla, is unveiling this session's version of the Green New Deal.
And what's interesting is I was reading in the New York Times this morning, their proposal is apparently centered all around, quote, green public housing. You know, there's been a lot of talk since the Biden infrastructure plan was announced, and so little of it is actually what we would think of it as infrastructure, that basically anything you want to be infrastructure, you would consider infrastructure. Now, we can debate public housing. That's certainly a relevant policy to debate, but to say that it's tied up with the Green New Deal, it really is silly. You know, this is just another example of calling whatever your policy agenda is infrastructure or the Green New Deal and trying to sweep it up with a fast-moving train to get through Congress.
Green housing. Now that's interesting. I have been to some museums where it's quote unquote green and they had a garden up in the rooftop and I wanted to check it out. And when I went up there, it was so full of bees and all kinds of insects. It freaked me out and I ran back inside. So I hope that's not the case. Speaking of green, Tim, we may have another issue here in California. We are maybe having a drought again. LA this winter, I can only remember 3 days when we had rainfall. So Steve Greenhut, who authored PRI's newly released Winning the Water Wars, available on Amazon, he wrote an op-ed in the American Spectator about the upcoming drought.
It's a very interesting piece, and he basically says there's a lot of things that have happened in recent years where politicians have channeled their inner Rahm Emanuel, not letting a crisis go to waste. And he kind of makes the point that first, the talk of that we're facing a historic mega drought really is just hyperbole. But he says it's really, the oncoming of drought is really being used by those in the environmental community to push their long-standing agenda. And that's strictly limiting human water use, attacking agricultural water use. And really, I think the takeaway point from all of this is that it's been about 4 years since the last big drought ended. And what has California done to get ready? Well, really not much. We had the water bond passed in 2014 that had the money to build 2 above ground storage water infrastructure projects. That hasn't happened. Whatever talk there is of water projects at the Capitol, you don't hear anything about capturing water. And that's really what needs to be done. You know, he makes the subtitle of his book is, you know, we need to promote abundance rather than manage scarcity. And that's really what Sacramento seemingly is afraid to discuss at all, diverting to the kind of climate change agenda and heavy-handed government policies. And we're going to dictate how you live your life and what kind of business you do and how you manage your business.
Well, Tim, I remember back in that day when I was a kid and we celebrated Earth Day. Earth Day was about pollution and saving our environment, clean water, clean air. As kids, we used to have to do cleanup drives. We would clean up our school and the neighborhood, plant a tree. Now our streets are dirtier than ever. There are homeless encampments, needles, human waste, and many parts of the state, residents are still having trouble getting clean drinking water. So it's really appalling that there's so much focus on climate change and almost no effort on cleanup, clean water, and the everyday mess on our streets and freeways.
Yeah, and I think it goes kind of hand in hand with a lot of these kind of green policies that Democrats at the state capitol have put in place or want to put in place, the impact they have on poor, rural, inland, and minority communities. And you hear a lot of talk from many of these same folks about how we need to look out for these folks, but the very so-called green policies that they impose on them put in place crushing energy burdens, like with their effort to shut down fracking in California, would take away job opportunities and opportunities for people with high school diplomas to get very good paying jobs. These electric car subsidies, as our Wayne Weingarten found, it's only benefiting the rich. Poor people aren't taking advantage of those to buy a Tesla. So it's really another front in this long-going policy divide of policies that are favoring the elite at the expense of poor, rural, and minority communities.
Our listeners will hear a lot about this from our expert, Julian Morris. But before we launch into the interview, we have a little commercial. We just announced that our San Francisco Gala this year is on October 2nd. That's Saturday at the Ritz-Carlton. We didn't have a gala last year because of COVID, so I think there's going to be a pent-up demand. So if you're listening to this podcast, you have a jump on everyone else. Tickets aren't selling now, but they'll be available in July. Save the date. It's going to be a great evening. Oh, and I forgot to mention that Mark Levin is going to be the keynote speaker. So Tim and I would love to see everyone there. Thanks for joining us. Happy Earth Day, Julian, and to all of our listeners. So April 22nd marks Earth Day. So let's start off with an Earth Day question. It's been more than 50 years since Earth Day was first celebrated back in 1970. How about giving our listeners the lay of the land? Is America and the world cleaner today than it was half a century ago?
Hi, Rowena. Thanks for having me. On nearly every measure, America and the world are cleaner and greener than they were 50 years ago. Data from the EPA show that between 1970 and 2019, the combined emissions of the 6 most common air pollutants, particulate matter, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides, volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, and lead, dropped by 77%. That's more than 2/3. Similar reductions in emissions have occurred in nearly all wealthy countries. By contrast, many poorer countries have seen increases in outdoor air emission. However, the more deadly indoor air pollution caused by burning wood and dung in poorly flued fires has fallen dramatically as those countries have grown and shifted to cleaner energy, including electricity and natural gas. So the damage to human health from air pollution has been declining, even as outdoor air quality has in some cases worsened in those countries. But there's also good news, even in those poorer countries, because many societies that have industrialized rapidly are now putting in place effective controls on outdoor air pollution too. Meanwhile, if we look at the deadliest forms of water pollution, those associated with untreated sewage and causing diseases such as cholera and dysentery, have been falling nearly everywhere as societies shift towards piped water, using antibacterials such as chlorine to decontaminate the water, and installing sewage treatment facilities. All this would likely be surprising to the organisers of the original Earth Day, who believed that economic growth would be harmful to the environment. Yet it turns out that economic growth and environmental protection are strongly correlated with one another. There are 2 reasons for this. First, both economic growth and improvements in environmental quality are strongly correlated with economic freedom. That has a lot to do with the ability to own and protect property, which is both a fundamental building block of entrepreneurial activity and crucial for the ability to protect the environment. This was one of the most important insights of the late Nobel Prize-winning economist Elinor Ostrom, who showed that property ownership incentivizes conservation and sustainable use. Second, as societies become wealthier, they are better able to afford to invest in environmental protection. So for those people who celebrated the first Earth Day, I think everything would be a little bit surprising. It's not turned out quite the way they imagined, but it's certainly a lot better than most of them thought would be the case.
So you just co-authored a brief for the Reason Foundation called "Would a Green Fiscal Stimulus Help the Environment and the Economy?" Now, President Biden seems to think it will, and he believes it will lower carbon emissions and create millions of new jobs. What do you think? Would his green proposals actually stimulate the economy?
Well, first, there's the economic side of this. And the evidence is that while fiscal interventions in the form of subsidies and tax expenditure can result in a short-term increase in economic activity, they tend to reduce longer-term economic growth. This is because economic activity is a bottom-up process. It's driven by knowledge that is dispersed among the entire population. And the federal government, or the state government, or even the local government doesn't know what is in the minds of the hundreds of millions of people who make up the US economy. And it is less able to direct resources to the kinds of innovative investments that drive growth. The evidence actually suggests that the only fiscal policy that stimulates longer-term growth is cuts to corporate and personal income tax, combined with reductions in spending. But the Biden-Harris administration has proposed a range of subsidies and tax expenditures that will boost spending on specific technologies, on wind, solar, and other allegedly green technologies. Similar subsidies implemented under the Biden administration boosted employment in low-skill, low-income industries, such as construction and waste management, while reducing employment in higher-skill, higher-income industries, such as the knowledge management industry. But the scale of the interventions proposed by the current administration is an order of magnitude greater than those implemented by Obama, who spent about $90 billion subsidizing renewable energy and other green technologies. Biden has proposed investing more than $2 trillion in total on green infrastructure, including tax credits to renewable energy, and $174 billion for electric vehicles. So the harm is likely to be an order of magnitude greater. And of course, to pay for those subsidies, Biden and Harris have proposed an increase in corporate and personal income taxes, the very things that are most likely to cause economic harm. So in combination, these increases in subsidies and taxes on productive economic activity will harm innovation and economic growth. Ironically, we also know that environmental improvements, including reductions in emissions, tend to come as a result of growth-enhancing innovation. In other words, the Biden-Harris policies are not sustainable and will ultimately have the opposite effect that's intended.
So, Julian, in blue state California, we've implemented a lot of the policies that the Biden administration has proposed. But as you know, Californians still suffer from high gas and electricity prices, higher unemployment relative to the rest of the country. And if you look at the supplemental data, we still have the highest poverty rate in the U.S. Let's get your thoughts on our beleaguered state, headquarters of both your think tank Reason and ours, PRI.
Thanks, Rena. California is in many ways a paradox. You know, it's home to some of the world's most innovative and successful companies: Google, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, Intel, and so on. Yet its legislature seems extremely hostile to innovation. Paradox number one. Paradox number two. In the early 20th century, California was one of the largest producers of oil in the world. Indeed, your listeners may not know that until 1975, California was largely self-sufficient in oil production and produced more of the US's oil than any other state except Texas. Of course, now California's legislature is opposed to the use of oil, wants to shift entirely towards electric vehicles and electricity produced by magic, apparently. The third paradox is that California's elite, including the founders of many of those who work in Silicon Valley businesses, espouse egalitarian values. Yet, as you note, the state has the highest poverty rate in the US. But I wonder, maybe it isn't a paradox, because the wealthy elite are insulated from reality. They can afford their Teslas and their $1 million San Francisco studios and have no idea how the policies they support harm the livelihoods of the majority of California's residents. So there, I think, is the tragedy. Paradox associated with ignorance.
You've also done a lot of work on the corporate average fuel economy standards, or for our acronym lovers, CAFE standards, and the zero emission fuel standards, or ZEV, which was started in California and followed by a dozen states and the District of Columbia. So what have you found, and have they actually delivered on their promises?
So as your listeners may know, the CAFE standards have been around since the 1970s. They were passed in 1975 and first came into force in 1978. And the original intention of the CAFE standards was to reduce US reliance on oil from the Middle East by increasing the fuel economy of vehicles on roads. So you reduce the consumption of oil by increasing the efficiency of the vehicles. Ultimately, the CAFE standards were based on essentially a false premise. They're predicated on the presumption that consumers don't adequately take into account the full benefit of more fuel efficient vehicles in terms of the total expenditure on both the vehicle and future fuel use. But the evidence is actually now ample evidence showing that consumers do take into account the future fuel costs when they're buying a vehicle, and there's more or less a one-to-one relationship between changes in fuel price and in other words, an expected future increases in cost and purchases of more fuel efficient cars, and vice versa. When fuel prices go down and the future price is expected to be lower, then the purchase of more fuel efficient cars goes down. But because the CAFE standards are based on this false premise, they effectively force manufacturers to sell vehicles that have lower average consumption than consumers would choose to purchase. And there's a trade-offs between fuel consumption of vehicles and other attributes. The comfort of the vehicle, the power of the vehicle is a big factor. And so basically, CAFE standards force consumers to make trade-offs that they otherwise wouldn't have to make. They would buy more powerful or more comfortable vehicles for the same price as the vehicle they're forced to have that has less power and less comfort, but is more fuel efficient. They also have another perverse effect. They drive up the price of new vehicles in general. And as a result, they lead to an increase in the average age of vehicles on the road. People who want more powerful vehicle will continue to own their older, more powerful vehicle or buy a used rather than pay a great deal more for an equivalently powered vehicle that's new. And since older vehicles tend to be less fuel efficient and more polluted, the effect of this is to somewhat diminish the supposed benefits of the CAFE standard. In addition, because people are being forced to buy vehicles that are more fuel efficient than they actually would want, people end up using those vehicles more than otherwise. This is known as the rebound effect. It probably accounts for upwards of a 10% increase in vehicle use, thereby offsetting, at least by 10%, the reduction in fuel use and emissions that would otherwise come from CAFE standards. So as a policy, it has all these perverse effects, has had very, very little effect on fuel use overall nationally. And in fact, if you look at the changes in oil demand over time, they continue to rise. But the original intention of CAFE standards has been met in another way. It's been met by the increase in the production of oil in the US, largely as a result of fracking. So CAFE standards haven't achieved what they intended to achieve, but the free market and the supply of oil has. Looking then at the other policy that California has innovated, zero emission vehicle standards. These just are kind of CAFE standards on steroids, because they're basically saying your vehicle may not emit any emissions in its use. But of course, supposedly zero emission vehicles do emit carbon emission because there's a great deal of carbon emissions caused by the production of all of the things that go into the vehicle in the first place. Firstly, in the manufacture of the vehicle, the manufacturing of lithium batteries and the manufacturing of the metal and so on that goes into the vehicle. And in fact, the embodied carbon of a zero emission vehicle is much greater than the embodied carbon of an internal combustion engine vehicle, for the simple reason that the mining of lithium and other rare earths is so intensive in its use of energy. So when a zero emission vehicle gets on the road, it's already done the equivalent of several tens of thousands of miles of a conventional vehicle in terms of emitting carbon dioxide. And then, of course, once it's on the road, it's still consuming energy, and much of that energy is coming from the burning of fossil fuels. Maybe a little bit less so in California, which has pushed the production of electricity by renewable forms, but still they rely on both local burning of gas and imports of electricity from other states, much of which is produced by very carbon intensive means. So zero emission vehicles, first of all, are not zero emissions, and they embody a lot of emissions even from the get-go. Finally, zero emission vehicles are driven much less than internal combustion engine vehicles. A recent study from the National Bureau of Economic Research found that zero emission vehicles are driven about 5,500 miles a year, which is about half the average of an internal combustion engine vehicle. And this suggests that it's going to take maybe a decade before your average zero emission vehicle is sort of the equivalent carbon emissions of an internal combustion engine vehicle. So these policies that seek to drive specific vehicles, if you excuse the pun, end up being perverse and counterproductive in so many ways and harm the average consumers and don't do very little, if anything, to protect the environment.
So turning from cars to broadband, President Biden's infrastructure proposal includes an expansion of broadband. The weaknesses of our broadband network were made pretty apparent during the pandemic when rural and poor families lacked access to affordable broadband, and their children had trouble learning online. Also, seniors weren't able to take advantage of telehealth. Do you agree with this part of Biden's plan, and how do you see it being better implemented?
Well, it's true that not all households are connected to the internet, and that those that are connected have varying and sometimes very low connection speeds. But according to Pew, 70% of US adults do have a broadband connection at home. That's 25 down, 3 up connection. And so we're talking about, about a quarter of US adults, at least, who currently don't have broadband access. But one reason that not all homes have broadband is that fiber hasn't been laid to every building in the nation. Another reason is that people choose not to buy it. But just dealing with the fact that fiber hasn't been laid everywhere, because that's sort of where the Biden proposal is seeking to address the problem. The main reason for that is cost. It costs more to lay and maintain fiber connections in more remote locations. That's why you don't have fiber to every home in the States. But new technologies are bringing these costs down. So if you combine fiber backhaul with 5G, it makes the delivery of high bandwidth data to smaller rural towns feasible at much lower cost. Meanwhile, there's satellite-based broadband, such as Elon Musk's Starlink, which is becoming available at costs that are already approaching feasibility for many in rural areas. So to the extent that there's a policy imperative to enhance access, I think the most effective way to achieve that would be to provide households, schools, and businesses with vouchers that they could spend on the most appropriate service. Because ultimately, you're then addressing not only the infrastructure issue, but also the potential for people to be able to buy the service itself. And conceivably, neighborhoods could club together to spend these vouchers to purchase fiber access or to purchase satellite connection that is then redistributed. So there you'd address the infrastructure issue too. So I think the idea of kind of doling out tens of billions of dollars to industry to deliver fiber service, I think is misguided, given the various alternatives that exist and the kind of more incentive compatible solution that is embodied in having a voucher system. Whether that's likely to get any traction, I don't know, but it's certainly, I think, a more effective way of achieving the objective.
So another issue close to home here in California is, for our acronym fans, CEQA, or the California Environmental Quality Act, and pretty much responsible for California's housing shortage and the delays and high costs of pretty much anything getting built in California. You've done a lot of work on the national equivalent of CEQA, which is called the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So have these two acts, in your view, undermined growth in so many areas of our economy?
So I'll back up to look at the origins of NEPA a bit, which I don't know if your listeners are aware, but so NEPA was passed in the wake of the blowout of the Union oil platform off the coast of Santa Barbara in 1969. And the aim was to require major projects to undergo an environmental review before they would be permitted. The idea was to preempt a repeat of that environmental tragedy. Saw about 90,000 barrels of oil flow into the Santa Barbara Channel, causing damage to wildlife and so on. But environmental reviews can't foresee all eventualities. So since NEPA was passed, we've had the Exxon Valdez disaster, which saw nearly 11 million barrels of oil spill into the Prince William Sound of Alaska. And we've also had the Deepwater Horizon disaster, which saw nearly 5 million barrels of oil spill into the Gulf of Mexico. So larger disasters have happened in spite of having NEPA in place. It might be the case that NEPA has prevented some disasters and maybe made others less bad. And certainly both NEPA and CEQA were well-intentioned. But as we know, good intentions are not what matters. What matters is overall good outcome. And unfortunately, both CEQA and NEPA have enabled pressure groups to block all kinds of developments, and perhaps especially oil and gas projects, and in California, real estate developments and so on. But also mines, forestry projects, power stations. In essence, they've enabled pressure groups to block anything that involves the use of natural resources, the production of energy, or basically anything that makes life better for the majority of people in many respects. And they do that by requiring developers to undertake environmental impact assessments, which can then be used to justify opposition. And then these environmental and other pressure groups take legal action to challenge developments under the pretext that the projects don't adequately address environmental concerns that they have. They really sort of open up economic development to arbitrary and capricious claims. I mean, I would even question the constitutionality of some of these decisions. The result is that projects can be held up for years, even if there's no really substantive environmental concern. And of course, if you hold up a project for years and there's millions of dollars on the line, investors will get frustrated. And it really destroys the value of their investment. So yeah, these acts, as I said, well-intentioned, but they have been implemented in such a way as to do a lot of harm to development, even to developments that have definite environmental benefits. They get held up by this. It's totally perverse. And as you say, it's raising the costs of housing and other developments in California to no good end.
Julian, you're a senior fellow at Reason and a senior scholar at the International Center for Law and Economics, where your work focuses on the relationship between law, innovation, economic development, and environmental protection. So as you know, California has been losing many companies to other states thanks to its onerous regulatory climate and the high cost of living here. Silicon Valley has always been considered the birthplace of innovation, new ideas, but some say that it's losing its stature. What are your thoughts, and what can the state do to maintain its leadership position?
So, I think one has to look at sort of the causes of the problem, and it seems that there's at least three significant causes. First of which is very, very high state income taxes. If you compare the amount that a person earning $300,000 would take home in California to, say, the same person in Florida or Texas, the contrast is dramatic. In California, they pay $114,000 in federal and state taxes. In Florida or Texas, they'd only pay $89,000. So they're paying $25,000 a year more for the privilege of living in California. Second, you talk about regulation. Well, a big factor there is zoning laws and building code, which in addition to CEQA have driven up the cost of housing in California dramatically, perhaps especially in the Bay Area. And with high demand and limited supply, the price of accommodation has been pushed through the roof. So in 2020, the average rental price of a two-bedroom apartment in San Francisco was $4,500 a month. By contrast, the average rental price of a two-bedroom apartment in Austin or Miami was about $1,500. So you're paying $3,000 a month for your two-bedroom apartment on top of what you would be paying in Austin or Miami. So a single person earning $300,000 would save $25,000 on taxes and $36,000 on rent by moving from San Francisco to Austin or Miami. Well, that's a pretty big motive to move, in my view, and it's clearly, you've clearly seen it in action with people moving to those cities in droves. Thirdly, I think leftist groupthink in the Bay Area may be daunting for people who support freedom and free markets. And I personally know several people who've left San Francisco for that reason alone. I'm not sure we're going to overcome the leftist groupthink problem in any time soon, although it might be necessary in part to address the other problem. If you want to reduce taxes and enable more development that would bring down the cost of housing, addressing all these problems in a collective sense is going to be necessary. Fortunately, there are some moves in the right direction. There are YIMBY in the Bay Area, who I'm sure you're familiar with, who the YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard, right? So if it's possible to sort of shift away from this no development mindset, I think you could at least bring down the cost of housing. Addressing the high taxes is another matter.
So you, in studying innovation at Reason, you've also done extensive research during the pandemic on how the U.S. could better cope with COVID. And while millions have been vaccinated, much of the world has not. And public health professionals say that we could see variants of the COVID virus for months, even years to come. So based on your your research, what could we do better to cope with future outbreaks of COVID-19?
So most of my research looked at the problem of enabling people to interact without becoming exposed to COVID. So I looked at the possibility for business to develop standards that would reduce the chance of transmission, and also to adopt mechanisms where they would be able to identify whether a person coming into their place of work or into a restaurant or whatever was likely to have COVID. So I think more could still be done in that realm. Some businesses have adopted some standards. Some of the international restaurant and accommodation businesses have begun to adopt standards, which is interesting. And you've seen the development of a number of mobile apps that enable, for example, airlines to identify a person's COVID status or their vaccination status, or both. I think those sorts of technology could be more widely adopted. And if they were more widely adopted, then I think you would have a more effective mechanism for enabling businesses to prevent transmission of COVID without requiring lockdown. So the context for all of this is, lockdown is terrible. It's devastating to the human psyche. It's devastating to many businesses. So you need to have a solution that is less bad than lockdown. And I think that having these standards for how people interact in businesses and standards for enabling people to demonstrate their COVID status or their vaccine status to others. Those sorts of technologies, if more widely adopted, I think could be game changers in terms of reducing the prospects for future waves of COVID to cause harm. On top of that, I think businesses probably do more to roll out vaccine. The UK and the US governments, I think, did a pretty good job actually in terms of their pre-commitments to purchase vaccines. But political allocation of vaccines is a really bad idea. Much better to allow markets to work. The US has done that to some extent. The UK has done that to some extent. Europe has utterly failed to do that. So you see this huge contrast in the rollout of vaccines between kind of UK and the US and Europe, basically because of the differences in approach both to purchasing of vaccines in the first place and then to the way that they've been rolled out. But I do think that businesses now seeing the future being tied to having the majority of people vaccinated, they should have a strong incentive to get everyone vaccinated as fast as possible. And they should be allowed to do so. So let's remove vaccination from the political realm and put it into the business realm, to the economic realm.
Finally, Julian, for our favorite question, we call our podcast Next Round because PRI is headquartered near wine country. So we like to ask all of our guests for a wine, beer, or a cocktail recommendation for our listeners. What are you drinking these days as we come out of our shelters and finally enjoy everything America has to offer?
So I have to be honest that I'm a big fan of Rhone wines, and perhaps especially during winter when big, heavy Grenache dominant wines of Gigonda and other villages in the Rhone. And I'm a big fan right now of Saint Cosme, which is one of the best producers in the region and has a really spectacular Côte du Rhône. But I will say that California produces also some amazing Rhone style wines, especially Northern Rhone style wines. The Stag's Leap and Plumpjack Syrahs are really astounding. And then at the more everyday scale, I quite like Kipé's Syrah. It's pretty decent for a decent price. As the weather warms up, and it's beginning to warm up now, I tend to switch to Burgundy style wines. So again, I'm sorry, I tend to buy New Zealand Pinots or some French Pinots, which tend to be reliable and good value. But California does produce some pretty great Pinots, as anybody who's watched Sideways knows. Oh, I also do drink some whites, but I'm sorry, I drink Albarino and Fuli and stuff. So, I like California wines, but they're not the best value. Unfortunately, there must be something to that.
Thanks so much, Julian. Just so you know, Sally Pipes, our president, also favors Rhone wines. So thanks again.
Sure, pleasure.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.